How did the first two parties of the U.S. start, you may ask? Well, it all began with the ominous task. The writing of the Constitution was the cause that made the cooperation of differing senators pause. Virginia proposed a large state plan, of which every state with a big population was a fan. But states like New Jersey had to disagree and argued that Virginia was just power hungry. Between the delegates there was much debate, and the great compromise they did create. Representation by population in the House of Reps was set up, while two envoys from every state in the Senate met up. Through the Electoral College, presidents were elected, instead of being directly selected. Were the slaves really people, and did they get a vote? The North said no, but the South was in a different boat. They debated over it some and had to revise and revise. They eventually came up with a 3/5 compromise. Out of every 5 slaves, they only counted 3. The other 2 were not significant in any degree. The Anti-Federalists didn't like the central government to be strong. A sort of political faction was synthesized before too long. The leaders consisted of Sam Adams, Patrick Henry, and Henry Lee, and was made up of the poor classes and the states' right devotees. The influential Federalists had an advantage, though. They were better organized, more educated, and had more dough. Washington and Franklin were among their supporters. Most Federalists lived along the sea borders. With parts of the Constitution Anti-Federalists didn't concur, they felt an addition such as the Bill of Rights had to occur. Their freedoms were put at risk without one, and should individuals be allowed to carry a gun? The Constitution drafted at Philadelphia, the Anti-Federalists opposed. What did they feel was left out, do you suppose? Freedom of religion and trial by jury. James Madison set out to include these rights in a hurry. In 1791, the Bill of Rights was adopted by the states. Freedom of speech, press, and religion were only some of its traits. One of the most important ratifications was the 10th. Hooray! All rights not specified by the Bill of Rights were states' rights. Oh, yay! Hamilton anticipated the idea of a federal bank, thought it'd be beneficial to the government and treasury, to be frank. Paper money came to be an issue of great urgency, and with the creation of a bank came a stable currency. But of course, Democratic Republican Jefferson disagreed. In his mind, enforcement of strict construction was in need. Power to charter banks wasn't in the hands of Congress but states. This was a statement to which the feds couldn't relate. But Hamilton thought interpretation should be broad, didn't want the Constitution to be read so literally by the bod. But in the end, Alexander Hamilton's idea won. His bank measure was signed by Washington in 1791. Before political parties, America only functioned with factions. Ideas of permanent political parties brought about negative reactions. But factions were safe because they ran their course then faded away. When the two-party system emerged, what do you think the fathers had to say? They came to a consensus that it hurt rather than helped. It created dissent, argument, and bogged down the government, they yelped. But in actuality, it helped balance our country, because in truth, the two parties checked and balanced each other with fist and tooth. The Franco-American alliance of 1778 was still in effect. France helped us, so now it is them who we should protect. The Jets were eager to go into war on France's side, but Washington stopped them before they tried. America at this time was still only a baby. Weak military and economy is why he didn't want us to enter, maybe. But let us mature until we're strong enough to fight as we please, and on this Jefferson and Hamilton both had to agree. In 1793, Washington issued his Proclamation of Neutrality, after the eruption of French and British brutality. This upset the French because they felt they had been betrayed, though it pleased the Federalists once the decision had been made. But the Jeffersonians could sleep well knowing one fact: France would have been worse off if we had honored the pact. The British would have blockaded the American coast, and the French West Indies wouldn't have had the foodstuffs they needed the most.
John Jay's Treaty of 1794 with France was another point of fracture. It caused the agrarian Jeffersonians no rapture. The pact seemed like a surrender to Great Britain. The advantages to the Federalists were not hidden. The coastal Federalists could collect the reparations from their seized ships, while the Southern planters really got zip. Instead, they had to pay their old debts, so they felt Federalist John Jay was not a good rep. President Washington was just trying to avoid a war with France, but all the Jeffersonians got were empty pockets in their pants. Hamilton had revealed the U.S. negotiation details to the opposition, so France turned down most of Jay's propositions. So in the end, Britain only agreed to a couple of concessions: repayment of seized ships and their U.S. port recessions. That's why the Jeffersonians got the short end of the stick and decided to revitalize their movement quick. Alien Jeffersonians also suffered horrible fates during the Federalist-dominated year of 1798. The Feds passed a series of legislations which held for the Jeffersonians grim implications. The immigrant Jeffersonians were for the most part poor. The new laws said their years of residence in the U.S. must be 10 plus 4. Before, it was just 5 measly years, but the growth of the Jeffersonians was a Federalist fear. Another law let the president deport or jail the Jeffs. Of their natural rights, they were bereft. The Lockjaw Sedition Act said no Federalist government slander, so many Jeffersonians were locked up because of their candor. These laws were yet another Federalist attack against the Jeffersonians who had each other's back. They would not take this lying down and hiding. If they went down fighting. So Madison and Jefferson came up with a plan of action to take down the dirty centralist supporting faction. In order to protect precious constitutional rights, 2 balancing parties must be in sight. Jefferson and Madison both secretly wrote resolutions, which in 1798 Kentucky and Virginia passed as solutions. To the problem of too strong a central power, to this the Federalist slates glowered. Their resolution said the federal was the state's creation, a contract between the states and central of the nation. If the federal government overstepped its authority, its role, the states had the right to nullify their laws in whole. However, most states didn't think this view was right and refused to sign their documents of might. They said only the Supreme Court could nullify legislation, but the resolutions were still a wealth of information. And so the election of 1800 was on the approach. It was Jefferson whom the Feds wanted to reproach. In order to make sure Adams would win the election, the Feds smeared Jefferson with dishonorable connections. They said he stole a trust fund from a widow and her heirs, and that he was also having indiscriminate affairs. With his own black slave woman, no less, they demanded that he immediately confess. The clergy hated him for helping separate church and state. People even called him atheist. It was obvious their hate. Much mudslinging was present in the elections of 1800, but even through this, Jefferson did not slow. There was a little hitch in Jefferson's presidential aspirations, something that dampened his high expectations. His running mate Aaron Burr got the same number of votes. The Electoral College had obviously compared notes. They thought Burr would be a better selection, so the deadlock went to the House of Reps for inspection. The process of voting in the House was a pain, but finally Jefferson was the candidate to gain. The Jeffersonians saw the victory as a revolution, a rightful tribute to their beloved Constitution. They said the election of 1800 represented and revived the 1776 spirit, when republicanism, liberty, and virtue were shouted so loud you could hear it. In a way, the election was a victory for the Feds as well. The power of the executive was transferred peacefully. That's swell. Their experiment in democracy was difficult but successful. Now Franklin in his grave could smile and be restful. So, at the end of the century, democratic ideals won out. In happiness, all of the Jeffersonians could shout. America would be equalized by 2 camps, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans.